Disclaimer: J.K. Rowling owns Harry Potter is not a straw man argument.
I still consider Slinkhard's view of counter-jinxes to be a straw man argument,
Hermione said in defense class that day. Through a slightly obsessive effort, she had managed to plow through Wilbert Slinkhard's drivel of a textbook in the past week, and was now being quizzed on it by Umbridge for her trouble.
"Excuse me?"
the disagreeable woman said.
Well, using the term counter-jinx in the context he does isn't even standard terminology. A counter-jinx more commonly means a spell to reverse a jinx. Slinkhard seems to be using it to refer to a more offensive sort of spell to make a point. Oh, really? And what point would that be? Slinkhard's central thesis seems to be that defensive magic should be purely, well, defensive. And yes, I know that sounds tautological, but it's really not. He goes on at length about shielding and concealment, but he looks down on mostly harmless offensive spells that are designed to incapacitate an opponent, like tongue-tying jinxes or stick-fast hexes, as in the counter-jinx passage. I think that's a very incomplete way of looking at self-defense.
That didn't go over too well. The exchange immediately ended with Umbridge taking 5 points from Gryffindor for disrupting class with pointless interruptions, and then Harry sticking his foot in it. He just had to mouth off about Voldemort when she brought up Quirrell. There was a silence in which Hermione barely restrained herself from smacking herself on the forehead, and then,
"Another week's detention will do you a great deal of good, I think, Mr. Potter."
Hermione gasped in horror. She chanced to look at Harry and saw he had turned pale, but he still wore a defiant expression. She was so angry at Harry and Umbridge both that she had snapped 2 quills by dinner time. She didn't even try to defend Harry when Angelina laid into him again for missing Quidditch practice, or when Professor McGonagall took points from him. But as foolish as he was, Umbridge was worse. Another week like the last one could do serious damage to Harry's hand. The one spot of good news that day was that she heard through the grapevine that Cho had cornered Cedric, kissed him, and apologized for being such a lousy girlfriend all summer. So it looked like Hermione's talk had made an impression on her. She didn't know if it would last, but it was a start. That night Hermione demanded that Harry call Sirius and Remus again. They also laid into him, even Sirius, who said it was one thing to fight the power, but he had to be smarter about how he did it. They had some bad news for him on their end, too. Amelia Bones was justifiably angry about Umbridge's punishment, but she didn't have the political leverage to make a move against her. She was more likely to be fired herself if she fought that fight. Sirius then asked an annoyed Harry if he had looked into the school bylaws yet. He hadn't, but Hermione had. Unfortunately, she'd found that corporal punishment was still allowed at Hogwarts so long as it didn't cause serious injury. It wasn't clear what constituted a serious injury, but she was mindful about what Septima had said about bending the rules.
"If Umbridge is as sneaky as Septima says," she told them, "she'll be able to make the argument that it's not serious."
"Well, that's no good," Sirius said. "I don't get it. I thought they'd changed the bylaws. Filch would hang us by our ankles sometimes when he caught us sneaking around, but he stopped after our 4th year." Hermione ignored how absurd that punishment sounded and said,
"I don't know. I can ask Septima about it, though."
"Yeah, you should try that. Maybe McGonagall, too." The next couple days passed like a whirlwind. Hermione's first class to be inspected by Umbridge was Transfiguration on Tuesday, which was highly entertaining given Professor McGonagall's condescending remarks to the High Inquisitor's interruptions of her class. Umbridge also inspected the Care of Magical Creatures class and sounded a little too interested in why Hagrid wasn't back yet. Professor Grubbly Plank was professional and still took Professor Dumbledore's line, though. That afternoon, Hermione spoke to Septima about school punishments. She learnt that while the bylaws hadn't been changed, Dumbledore had thought Filch's punishments were excessive, especially given the stress of wartime, and used his discretion as headmaster to forbid him from using them. Harry was in detention till nearly midnight that night, but as soon as he got back, she demanded he call up Sirius on his mirror and told them. Harry's godfather laughed. "That makes it easy, then," he said gleefully. "Just tell Dumbledore what that woman is doing to you and ask him to use his discretion to stop it." "I don't want to bother him," he started. Hermione cut him off and asked the more important question.
Is that safe? I mean, Professor Dumbledore's the one she really wants.
He may not have the leverage he used to, but he cares about his students, especially Harry, Remus said. He won't want to let this go, and he does still have the influence to take care of it. If it goes to the public, or even the Board of Governors, they'll take his side. Harry still didn't really want to do it, but Hermione insisted.
You still need to tell him about your scar anyway, she said.
On Wednesday morning, Harry showed his hand to Professor McGonagall. Professor McGonagall reportedly had a fit that was most unbecoming of a teacher and then told Professor Dumbledore. Professor Dumbledore made a note of Harry's scar hurting, but said he was probably just picking up emotions from Voldemort like before. Harry said Dumbledore didn't seem very supportive and barely even looked at him before sending him on his way, so he wasn't confident about the outcome. However, by that afternoon, he was told that his detention had been reassigned to Mr. Filch. Hermione went to bed that night feeling pretty pleased with herself. Then, on Thursday, a new notice appeared on the bulletin board. By order of the High Inquisitor of Hogwarts, the High Inquisitor will henceforth have supreme authority over all punishments, sanctions, and removal of privileges pertaining to the students of Hogwarts, and the power to alter such punishments, sanctions, and removals of privileges as may have been placed by other staff members. The above is in accordance with Educational Decree No. 24, signed by Dolores Jane Umbridge, High Inquisitor.
Oh, you have got to be kidding me!
Nice going, Hermione.
I was only trying to help.
Harry didn't feel like talking to Hermione the rest of the day, and to add insult to injury, his first class that morning, arithmancy, was under inspection by the High Inquisitor herself. It didn't surprise him at all when Umbridge smiled her wicked smile at him when he walked in the door and told him,
Mr. Potter, your detention has been reassigned back to me. Please report to my office at 5 o'clock.
Despite this, Harry was interested to see how Umbridge's inspection of Professor Vector would go, since, according to Hermione, they had known each other for a long time. He hoped that meant Professor Vector would run circles around her like Professor McGonagall had. Professor Vector didn't play it quite as aloof as McGonagall. She nodded to Umbridge and said,
Good morning, Dolores,
when she entered, but she then collected the homework and began lecturing as if nothing unusual were happening. They were beginning the year with a detailed study of functions and how they described relations between one aspect of spells and another. Harry didn't really see the importance so far. Professor Vector spoke like there was some deep meaning behind the idea that equations themselves could be looked at as objects to be manipulated, but to him it still looked like they were just moving variables around in the equations. True, not all functions were equations in the normal sense, but most of the ones they'd be using in spells this year certainly were.
Now, most piecewise functions won't be relevant for the spellcrafting we'll be doing, Professor Vector said. But one particular class of them... Ahem, said Professor Umbridge. Yes, Dolores? I take it that you received my note telling you the time and date of your inspection, Professor? Umbridge said with her usual saccharine-ness. Professor Vector raised her eyebrow at her. Oh, was that today, Dolores? I was under the impression that you were interested in a refresher course in my class. If you want to arrange an independent study, I'd be happy to talk at the end of the period. Excuse me? Umbridge said amid stifled sniggers from the class. Even Draco Malfoy looked like he was trying not to laugh. Oh, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Most witches and wizards are simply too busy to keep their arithmancy skills sharp after graduation, especially an esteemed ministry representative such as yourself. And we both know I have some experience with one-on-one tutoring, Dolores. Most of the class caught on at once and had to fight even harder not to laugh. Harry could see Umbridge turning red and wondered if this was what the two professors were like as students. He thought Umbridge might spout off some personal insult, but she restrained herself and said, I am merely here to inspect your class, Professor Vector. Then by all means, Vector said. Now, the piecewise functions that most commonly appear in spellcrafting are absolute value functions. We'll discuss later the proper usage of absolute value functions versus square roots. Harry had to admire Professor Vector. It seemed like a classic Slytherin move, subtly questioning Umbridge's maths skills without actually saying anything. It was a bit risky, maybe, but Umbridge didn't try anything the whole rest of the class, just made notes on her parchment.
so that was a plus. Hermione was still in a bad mood that afternoon when she went to her study group with Daphne Greengrass and Tracy Davis, and she wasn't exactly subtle about it as she unthinkingly dropped her books on the table and collapsed into the chair with a scowl.
"Oi, Granger, what's got into you?"
Davis asked.
"Huh?"
She snapped out of it.
"Oh, just this stupid feud between Harry and Professor Umbridge." "Of course it is. Is this about the new educational decree this morning?" "Yes. Harry, found a loophole to get his detention this week reassigned, but Umbridge went around him and changed the rules."
Hermione didn't mention her own part in the affair. Harry wasn't the only one who was unhappy about the new rule, after all.
"Ah, the wonderful life of the boy who lived," Greengrass said smugly. "Don't you start, Greengrass. Let's just pretend that we don't disagree about Voldemort and all that, shall we?"
Greengrass and Davis both yelped in horror.
I know. Don't let the other Slytherins hear that," Hermione said. "And that's why you're a Gryffindor, Granger," Davis said. "No Ravenclaw would be that crazy, no matter how smart she was." "It's not about the houses," she snapped. "It's about not being intimidated."
Honestly, had people at this school defined each other by their houses this much her first 3 years here?
"Come on, let's just get to studying."
They did, and managed to be civil about it. The Slytherin girls didn't want to arouse Hermione's ire, and Hermione was too tired to start an argument. It took a while, but they gradually relaxed around each other. Really, Hermione didn't particularly need their help, even for charms and magical creatures, which they were nominally helping her with, although it was nice to have them to lean on. And Greengrass, at least, didn't really need Hermione's help to pass arithmancy, although she would definitely help improve her marks. Actually, that was more of a learning experience for Hermione. She needed to learn how to teach the fifth-year basic algebra concepts without losing her patience. It was a lot different from trying to talk Septima through real analysis, or even through linear algebra. And even now, she still felt the need to inject interesting, but irrelevant, university-level background to the maths they were talking about. Anytime she saw the other girl's eyes glaze over when she went off about discrete functions or number theory or some such, she knew she needed to tone it down. Greengrass looked annoyed with her frequent diversions, but Davis seemed to think it was funny, probably laughing at how she couldn't stay on topic, she guessed.
"So how did you get to be an arithmancy super genius anyway?" Davis asked about the third or fourth time it happened. "I was born that way, I suppose," Hermione said. "Granted, it also took a lot of hard work, but I needed something to work with to get anywhere." "Well, I didn't think it was all natural talent," Greengrass said. "But how do you go from not knowing anything about magic to doing groundbreaking research in only 4 years?" "First off, I knew loads of maths before I came to Hogwarts," Hermione said, ignoring the subtle dig at her heritage. "I'd been learning that since before I can even remember." "Seriously? You must have been one weird kid," Davis exclaimed.
Hermione noted the jibe, but took it in stride.
"Oh, I'll admit that. It's just that numbers came so easily to me that I wanted to learn all I could. And then, when I found out I could invent magic spells with them, I felt like, where have you been all my life?"
Both of the other girls giggled at that good-naturedly. Greengrass smiled and said,
"Trust you, Granger, to be married to your numbers." "You're just jealous," Hermione grinned back. "Debatable. So what do you want to do with it? Is it the professional arithmancer life for you?"
Hermione didn't mention many of her ideas that might be helpful in the war, and just said,
"That's what I'm looking at. I have enough research ideas to last me a long time, and I feel like I'd like to have a proper office or laboratory, like an enchantress or an unspeakable." "Unspeakable?" Davis said. "Ambitious. Not many people interested in that straight out." "Well, that's me. So what about you two? Any grand plans for the future?"
It wasn't quite as safe a question to ask a pair of Slytherins as a Gryffindor, especially these days. They didn't telegraph their intentions so much, and not without reason. They looked at each other and seemed to hold a silent conversation. But Greengrass shrugged and answered,
"Oh, you know, learning magic, practicing my political and social skills, becoming a skilled witch able to manage a large estate, and ideally finding a future husband befitting a proper pure-blood lady."
Hermione secretly wondered how Greengrass felt about how close Malfoy was with Parkinson. He was on the top of the social ladder, but then again, they didn't share the same politics, which were pretty important around here.
"Is that it?"
she asked cautiously.
I'm not locked into it, if that's what you mean, Granger," she said with a touch of indignation. "But if my mother and a lot of my friends' mothers are any indication, a well-connected witch can always find something interesting to do in her normal life." "Well, I wish you luck with that. You have any plans, Davis?" "I'm not as well connected as Daphne here. I might go to ministry. Might just take a job in a shop for a while. A nice shop," she added for clarity.
It was an interesting conversation. Hermione wasn't much aware of what work was available in the magical world outside her own narrow field. And without, in the best case, Muggle history, science, and literature, most witches and wizards would need remedial classes to find good work in the Muggle world. It seemed like that was one of those isolating factors that had always worried her a bit about magical life. The problems of magical education simmered in the back of her mind, and she discreetly checked her watch. 5 o'clock. Harry would be going to Umbridge's office right now for his 7th detention with the Wicked Witch, and Hermione had a bad feeling she'd keep him past midnight again as punishment for weaseling out of yesterday. It was barbaric. In the Muggle world, Umbridge would have been arrested after the first night, and would be facing 10 years in prison for cruelty to a child. Hermione had looked up the penalty when she first realized how awful Harry's relatives were. After a while, she realized that maybe there was something else her new acquaintances could help her with.
"Greengrass, you're from an old family that's been involved in politics for a long time, right?"
she asked.
"What's it to you?"
Greengrass said suspiciously.
"I was just wondering if you knew what the final governing authority over Hogwarts is. I've been trying to trace the history, and it all seems very complicated." "Oh, it's not that complicated. Hogwarts was founded, funded, and operated by the founders themselves before there was any government for wizards. It's always operated independently ever since, and the Ministry recognizes its legal status, of course." "So it was presumably grandfathered into the law as a non-profit organization?" "I have no idea what that means, Granger." "They let it exist as is because it was there before the Ministry and is a respected institution?" She tried. "Well, sort of," Greengrass explained. "Hogwarts is independent, but under Ministry law, all school-aged children in Britain are required to attend an accredited school or educational program. That's why you're back this year, isn't it? Changes to accreditation rules? And the Ministry gives Hogwarts its accreditation."
Hermione frowned.
"So they could take it away if they wanted to?"
That would be very bad. But Greengrass and Davis burst out laughing.
"Oh, Merlin's beard, Granger!" Greengrass gasped. "Please tell me you're not that naive. I mean, sure they could in theory, but there'd be a riot. People would keep sending their kids here anyway because there's nowhere else to go in the country. Employers would still accept Hogwarts diplomas because there's nothing better around. The Ministry would lose all credibility. Even the High Inquisitor couldn't do that." "Then how can they force the school to hire a High Inquisitor at all? Isn't that up to the Board of Governors, then?" "It's supposed to be, but it's not that simple. I get where you're coming from. I wrote my grandfather after I saw how Umbridge was teaching. We agree with you Gryffindors on one thing. That woman is teaching a completely crap class. He explained to me how they got it all done. I asked just to be sure, and yes, the Board of Governors does have the final authority over the school. It always has." "So how did they do it?" "Easy. Fudge forced through a bunch of new accreditation requirements right before the term started. That's what all these educational degrees really are, accreditation requirements." "But you said the board didn't have to follow them." She never said that, Granger," Davis cut in. "The Ministry can't take our accreditation, but if the Board of Governors openly defied the rules, there'd be just as big a protest against them. They'd never get away with it." "Unless the rules got so ridiculous that everyone could see how wrong they were?" Hermione said hopefully. "Ha! You'll be waiting a long time for that," Greengrass said. "I bet most voters who don't have kids here don't even know what's going on yet." But that..." Hermione sputtered as her brain short-circuited and tried to reconnect. "So, the Ministry can't afford to take away the school's accreditation, but the board still can't get away with defying the Ministry?" she demanded. "Now you're learning, Granger," Davis quipped. "But that's completely ridiculous." "Yes, but that's the way the world works," Greengrass told her.
Hermione packed up her books and stood up.
"Excuse me, I think I need to go hex something."
Both girls raised their eyebrows.
"Don't let Umbridge find out about that,"
Davis advised.
"Don't worry, I won't."
It was the first time that year that Hermione had occasion to visit the Room of Requirement. The marvelous space on the 7th floor must have been designed by Rowena Ravenclaw herself. It acted as a catch-all magical storage room for the whole castle that only appeared when it was needed, and it could turn into any kind of room you asked for as long as everything in it could be transfigured, copied, or delivered up from its storage. In the past 4 years, it had supplied her with useful objects like dictaquills and broken wands for study, and even a room full of cushions to teach Harry the banishing charm last year. Today, Hermione felt her anger boiling over, and she wanted to fire off some hexes like she should have been doing in defense class. True to form, the room supplied a training room, which, based on her Muggle upbringing, looked like a police shooting range, with man-shaped silhouettes with bullseyes drawn on them. And so, she started casting spells. She was alarmed to find that her aim wasn't as good as she'd thought. She could usually hit the stationary targets, but not near the center, and she knew Muggle police officers could do a lot better with pistols. Her limited duels with Harry last year had been at closer quarters, and without formal training her self-study had been haphazard. She also found that she didn't have a great idea of what spells to cast in a duel. She knew quite a few, but the tactics and strategy of stringing them together wasn't something she'd thought a lot about. She mostly just threw them randomly, and she worried about herself a little when she started setting the targets on fire. Even with her prior experience, she was painfully aware of her shortcomings compared with what she'd read about Aurors and professional duelists. And even if she couldn't reach that level, wasn't this what she was supposed to be learning in class? How to defend herself against an experienced wizard who meant her harm? No, this would not do. Harry stumbled into the common room at 1:15, weary, bleary-eyed, and cradling his right hand, which was wrapped in a blood-stained scarf. He felt dead on his feet. He really hadn't got much sleep last night because Owl Year students apparently didn't get the luxury of sleeping in the night after astronomy class. He saw that Ginny, Ron, and Hermione had all waited up for him. Ginny jumped up and ran to him when she saw the state he was in.
"Harry, you finally got out," she said. "I can't believe she kept you this late again. There ought to be a rule."
She wrapped her arms around his chest, careful to avoid his injured hand, and kissed him, but he barely returned it. She frowned, but led him to a sofa so he could sit.
"I got you some more Mutlap essence,"
Hermione said, pushing a bowl of sickly yellow fluid towards him. Ginny helped him unwrap his hand. She hissed when she saw blood oozing from the gashes and immediately staining the bowl orange.
"I swear, the next time I see Percy," she growled, "if I can't hex Umbridge, I can definitely hex him."
"Uh-huh," Harry nodded absently. Hermione sighed when she saw the condition of her friend.
"You can't keep doing this, Harry. It's getting harder for me to justify taking out Mutlap essence. If you get any more detentions, you'll have to go to Madame Pomfrey directly."
"And get her in trouble too?" he grumbled. Ron shook his head from where he sat, leaning across the back of a chair.
"They can't stop Madame Pomfrey from helping you, mate," he said. "Heal his oath. She might not be able to stop Umbridge, but Umbridge can't do anything to her either." "I'm more worried about that hand," Ginny said. "Any more of this, and you'll have to go to Madame Pomfrey to get it healed properly anyway."
"Will you all cut it out?" Harry yelled. He bolted to his feet and pushed Ginny aside.
"I'm sick of everyone trying to give me advice when you all know there's not a damn thing anyone can do about it."
His 3 friends sat in stunned silence. Ron's and Hermione's eyebrows were both raised, and Ginny looked like she wasn't sure whether to be sad or angry. However, she was the first to collect herself. She slowly stood up behind him and started rubbing his shoulders. He slumped, and with a bit of prodding, she convinced him to sit back on the sofa and lean against her.
"You look exhausted, Harry," she said soothingly. "I'm sorry. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I know you've already got that in spades. You know, you've been snapping at us a lot this year, and I mean more than usual. I've known enough teenage boys to know."
I know. I'm sorry, Ginny. It's like I can't help it, he muttered. Everything makes me so angry lately. It's all so unfair. And worse, it's going to get people killed. I just wish there was something we could do about it. Hermione considered the idea that had been brooding in her mind all day long.
Maybe there is.
Harry looked up. What?
Maybe there is something we can do.
Now Ron and Ginny stared at her too.
What are you on about?
Ron said.
Doing something about Umbridge.
Ron perked up.
Really? What are you thinking? Poison? Or feeding her to something mad and hairy that Hagrid dragged in from the... Ow!
Hermione whacked him in the back of the head.
I didn't mean that, Ronald, she said. I was thinking maybe we could teach ourselves.
What? Harry said.
The three of us, like a study group. You can come too, Ginny, although it's not really your curriculum.
Harry shook his head. Umbridge won't go along with that. Sirius said she thinks Dumbledore's building an army. If she finds out we're practicing defense spells...
Then we'll have to make sure she doesn't find out. We can use the room of requirement and...
Come off it, Ron said. We're already behind on our homework. You want us to do more now?
This is about a lot more than homework, Ron. It's about making sure we can defend ourselves. I was practicing in the room of requirement today, and I realized how far I still have to go. Harry, you and I dueled a few times last year, but were you really ready to face Voldemort?
Face Voldemort? He said incredulously. Have you gone balmy? You don't get that out of a book. You don't get it from a class. Don't you remember what it was like when we fought the Basilisk or the Dementors? When there's nothing between you and dying but your own wits, and you can't remember half of what you learnt in class? When you have to try to think straight when you're about a second from dying or watching your friends torn limb from limb? He trailed off, seeing his friends actually weren't ignoring his words like he'd thought. But Hermione stepped forward and tried again.
I do remember, Harry, she said. When those Dementors attacked us, it was the most terrifying moment of my life. And all four of us were there, remember? We know what it's like, at least a little. But I also remember drilling myself day after day for months to learn the Patronus charm. And you did the same thing, and it worked. And in fact, if that happened now, we could probably hold out long enough to get to shelter. I think if we work together, and find some good books written by Aurors or war veterans or something, we can teach ourselves properly. And we can definitely teach ourselves better than Umbridge ever will. Just think about it, please.
Hermione went up to bed, but both Weasleys seemed to take her side.
I think that could work, Ron said. Plus, if we're teaching the class, we wouldn't have to give ourselves homework.
Harry threw a cushion at him.
Oi, I'm going to bed. You coming?
In a few minutes. Ron went upstairs, and Harry examined his hand, dripping with Murtlap essence. It was still bleeding a little. He reflected that if things were going to keep getting worse, he really ought to get a first aid kit. Maybe he could buy one when they had a Hogsmeade visit. Right now, all he could do to keep from getting bloodstains on his bed was to wrap it in tissues, and maybe wear a glove. He looked and saw Ginny watching him worriedly. "I'm guessing you're all for this idea too?" he asked. Ginny placed her hand on his shoulder again.
I think it'd be nice to actually learn some defense this year.
Harry suppressed a groan and started to turn away, but Ginny gripped his shoulder harder and stopped him.
Harry, I hate that you're involved in all of this, she said. Umbridge, you know who, everything. I wish you didn't have to worry about it, but if you know who isn't going to leave you alone, isn't going to leave us alone, we need to do more to be ready. Please think about it, okay?
All right, I will, Harry promised. Ginny smiled and kissed him briefly before going up to bed herself.